My name is Herb Grossbeck, and our esteemed panelists each have topics of preference that they want to chat with you about, after which we'll maybe talk a little bit among ourselves, and then the last half or so of the session will be to respond to your questions. So we'll start, if we could, with Mike Orsak, who's going to talk about helping boards to work together more effectively. Mike?
So I'll give you the perspective from a venture capitalist point of view. So first off, I'm delighted to be here to talk about building better boards and how to get boards to work together more effectively. Since I view it, number one, as an important topic in itself, but one actually that is not talked about that often. So I'm delighted that you're all showing an interest in talking about how to do this better. So I think having a good board can make a huge difference for a company, but at the same time, if you have a bad board, it can ruin your company. So it's worth thinking strategically about how you want to build and manage your board, much the same way you think about building the other parts of your company. So the approach I wanted to take is to look at the various stages of a board, from the startup stage to a later stage, because I assume most of you are in the early stages of starting your company, so I'll start there. First off, let's be honest, most of you want to start a company because you don't want to report to anyone. So the idea of reporting to a board could rankle you. So I suggest changing that mindset and viewing the board as a real asset that can help you, an opportunity, not a chore. So it's up to you to create a board that you respect and can work with. A good board helps you with a wide range of issues: hiring, partnerships, fundraising, and strategic direction. A good board should not get involved with operations of the company. That's what the management is there for. So here are some specifics, starting with starting a board. So I suggest keeping it small to start. If you're raising angel money, then 3 people on the board is really all you need. If you're raising venture money, then a typical starting size is 5, where you've got, let's say you have 2 investors, 2 from the founding side, and then 1 independent person. That's sort of a typical framework. You don't have to, that's not a cast in stone rule, but that happens often enough. But you want to leave room to grow later, because you'll find out it's far easier to add people than it is to replace someone. Angel investors generally don't want to take a board seat, whereas VCs generally do want to take a board seat. And then in terms of control of the board, usually that's why there's a split where you have VCs owning part or investors owning part, founders owning part, with the tie being held by an independent person. So then it's perceived as an equal balance. An example like Facebook, where he famously, Mark Zuckerberg, kept really control over the entire company, both at the board level and the voting structure, so he could never be ousted from the company if he didn't want to, or never be forced to sell the company. That is highly, highly unusual. He had enough power and enough momentum in his company to achieve that, but don't think by any means that you're going to get that. If you go to the VC route, then ideally you want to find VCs that have worked together before successfully and like each other. Because normally when you get VC money, you get more than one. It's rare to have just one VC. If you get VCs that don't work well together, that's a headache for everyone. And too many VCs on a board is a problem, but that's a later stage problem. You don't start out with too many, but it just happens over time. And then in terms of who you can get on your board, if you can get a very respected person in your industry to join your board, to be an anchor tenant, so to speak, that could be very valuable. It can help you build credibility with new hires, with investors, and customers. In terms of frequency of having board meetings, at the early stage, monthly frequency is good, moving to every 6 weeks as issues get worked out, then maybe every 2 months as the company matures. In terms of board members and their time, the good board members are very busy, so it's hard to get their time and commitment. That's true for both industry people as well as VCs. Quite a few of the better-known VCs are known as drive-by board members, meaning they're so busy they only have time for you at the board meeting, and that's only if they actually show up. So I suggest doing reference checks on potential board members to see how engaged they are and how supportive they are. Some VCs are notoriously difficult to deal with, so why entrepreneurs don't make a couple of calls ahead of time to find that out first still surprises me. Think about the skills and connections you'll need and try to add those elements to the board. For example, if you are relatively inexperienced at running a company, then finding someone with operating experience that relates to your industry is a very good idea. If your company's in an ecosystem where you'll need help dealing with a large player, whether it's a Microsoft or a Google or a Cisco or someone like that in your industry, get someone who knows the ins and outs of that company. Example I can think of is an entrepreneur was doing something that was in the ecosystem of VMware. They were doing security for virtualized environments, and that's mainly what VMware does. And so the question is, well, isn't VMware going to do what you're doing? So that person got someone who had been CTO at VMware to join his board, and that helped allay the concern because that person knew what VMware's plans were and could attest, well, no, VMware is not going to do this, so don't worry. And so that's an example of how getting someone in who knows the space can help with your credibility with investors and others. In terms of growing your board, the best boards think long and hard about new members and actually interview them to see if they're a good fit or not. That even happens with VCs. So if I'm going to say invest in a second round, and the first round investors say, well, actually we have a very good chemistry with our board now, and we want to make sure we don't mess it up. So we want to talk to you to make sure you're going to fit in. Rather than be insulted, I take that as that's very positive. Like, okay, they're taking it seriously, they're planning, they want to make sure this board is going to work well. There's nothing more frustrating to keep having to go to ineffective board meetings. Adding customers to your board is a no-no. There are other ways to keep them informed, so keep them off your board. And then if you're in a capital-intensive business, finding an investor with deep pockets can be very helpful to keep the funding going down the road. In terms of how to manage a board, I suggest communicating regularly to clear up any issues and misunderstandings. I really like the idea of having one-on-ones with a board member and the CEO, whether it's a coffee or a breakfast or before meetings, after meetings, so you have that open channel of dialogue. That can be very helpful because in a group setting, it can be very hard to be totally open or to bring up difficult issues, but in a one-on-one setting, you talk about things otherwise you could not. And then a board member should not be blindsided by a major issue at a board meeting. They should have been briefed ahead of time of what the issue was, then use the board meeting to discuss how to resolve the issue. And finally, on best practices, these are some ideas I've come across. If you have growing pains, or as you have growing pains, you can have meetings that designate a certain topic to be focused on for that meeting, like product development or sales or marketing or whatever your particular issue is. That way you can have concentrated time to deal with an important topic. Another idea is to designate certain people on the board to be the subject expert on things like accounting or compensation or manufacturing or sales or whatever it is, so that person can be more involved in the details of a decision, saving the other board members the time of having to do the deep dive to know all the details of something. And it's also very flattering for a CEO to turn to a board member and say, hey, so-and-so, you're the expert in this area. What do you suggest we do? And then some boards will have offsites so that board members get to know each other better, but that is not common at all by any means, but an interesting idea to consider. And I'll sum up by saying if you can make building a board a better priority rather than a random act, I think you'll be amply rewarded, and everyone will enjoy the process far greater. With that, turn it over to Joe.
Mike, that's terrific. Thank you very much. Actually, we're going to ask Lisa Stone to take over next, and Lisa wants to be excused a little bit early, so please be assured that it's no reflection on us when she leaves a little early to make another commitment. Lisa?
Thank you, Irv. My 14-year-old has a crew dinner, and I have to go there and cheer him on. He had a tough 4 a.m. season, tough on us all. But I am putting a stack of business cards here, because if you have something applied that you want to call my cell phone, do not email me and ask me. I will do it if you will give me 15 minutes of your time looking at some of our products, giving me your feedback. I think that Mike gave some fantastic advice here. I'd like to take his advice, none of which I disagree with, which is very unusual for me, and tell you how I apply it in a day-to-day world. So Blog Her, Inc. Has 47 employees. We have had 3 rounds of funding, A, B, and C. We reach 20 million women a month via a series of services for the most influential women in social media and blogs. We have conferences for women who blog, we have a major web hub, and we have a network of 2,500 curated blogs, primarily in food, family, and entertainment. Building this was very interesting because it started as a labor of love by my co-founders and myself. We bootstrapped for 2 years. We had a fully baked operational business plan with revenue coming in when we decided that we needed to go big or go home. We then went out on a very specific step down through venture capitalists. And I think we got some very important advice when it came to picking the people that you're going to be working with to lead your company. Katarina Fake, the founder of Flickr, some of you guys might know her, who is a brilliant woman and a fantastic community developer, said to me, there are 3 things you need to know in your priority list. And she built Flickr with angel funding and a little investment before she sold it to Yahoo. She said, people first, terms second, valuation third. You need to work with people you respect. They need to bring value to your company and insight to you as an entrepreneur. You need to actually trust them. You may not always like them, but if you do a deal with the right people, the terms that come out of it will be logical to you and will develop your business appropriately. And the valuation that comes out of these people and their terms will be something that you will most likely be able to live with. If you focus on the valuation and the money you think your initiative or your idea, if you don't have an operating company, is worth, you will agree to terms that are probably unreasonable because you're focused on that number, and you will most likely do a deal with the devil, and you will regret it. So when we went out and looked for these people, we very specifically went to find folks who had experience building consumer-oriented, large-scale grassroots networks that became massively profitable. Our Series A round was led by David Siminoff from Venrock. He built JDate and has done a number of things like 4Info, very experienced with the grimy first steps of early venture companies. Then we went to get a small investment from a strategic, the Peacock Equity Fund. They're the GE NBC media company. They were willing to take a smaller piece of the company. You never want to get wrapped around a strategic partner. You don't want a poison pill. But Brian Keel, who's on our board, has an superb experience in health, which is very important to women online and in gaming. And he's a great guy. He's someone who really knows how to work with a strategic partner, but also advocate for his portfolio. And then finally, in our Series C, and we've only raised $15.25 million. That is a shockingly low number for one of the 10 largest women's networks and 10 largest blog networks. We're very proud of what we've achieved. But we went very specifically after Azure Capital Partners, where Mike Quantinetz, who's the lead partner and has developed sites like cooking.com, education.com, Knowledge Adventure, has a great experience in working with final stage companies to help grow their valuation. And he's a great guy. One of the things that's most important is all of these guys are very willing to and interested in finding out what women are doing online. And this is interesting for someone who left traditional media in 1997 and was told by a bunch of people in this valley that women would really never go online in large numbers. None of these guys has ever said anything like that. In fact, they pushed my thinking, made me smarter. Here's how I work with them, just 3 quick notes. Exactly what Mike said about preparing, getting to know your board, preparing to present to them, and executing on those meetings is essential. I think that I can't say enough about putting an enormous amount of effort into your board presentations, making sure that you establish the one-on-one conversations, and that you behave consistently and predictably. You never surprise your parents. You never surprise your spouse. Do not surprise your board. It's just like a performance review. If you tell an employee something negative about their performance as you're managing them for the first time in a performance review, you've failed as a manager. They don't know what's coming. Don't do that to your board, and you don't have to. I've developed a series of very predictable board reports that go out every month. Whether I have a board meeting that month or not, we're down to 6 meetings a year. We used to have monthly board meetings. I'm very specific about what we do. And if they want a deviation to the format, they ask for it. Lise, this is working, this really isn't working. Could we have a little more here, a little less there? Awesome. Next time I send them something, I say, you asked for this, I prepared this, tell me what you think. If it's a big board meeting, I definitely have pre-meetings beforehand. I try to keep up with these guys once a month anyway. If there's a big issue that we need to work on, like a huge sales forecast or a huge product delivery idea or a brave new product concept, we have a separate supplemental meeting. I never waste their time. I always have an agenda. I know when they need to leave. Board dinners are important. The best way for a working mother of 3 to get to know the 4 guys who are traveling from all parts of the globe and on 20,000 other boards is for us to have dinner before the board meeting, not after the board meeting. Remember that they know each other, they like each other, you all have stuff in common, and then you can just get right down to business. Because if one of them closed an incredible, huge deal that they're going to want to tell the other guys about, I don't want them taking the board time, but I want them to be able to socialize. That's why they're on the board. Last thing I would say is, it's really impossible for me to communicate to you as someone who started out as a reporter and then became someone running this company, how very, very small this world is. I have seen some amazing missteps from people at other companies who either drink too much or talk too much in social situations with venture capitalists, with bankers, with investment bankers, with each other. I have come home to my own mother sometimes who lives in Redwood City and say, Mom, thank you so much for telling me that you are always to be on your best behavior because you don't know who you're talking to. This is true. Watch yourself. You can never, ever blame anybody else for anything that you've done that you sincerely regret. I was at a dinner once where someone made a terrible comment about someone who runs one of the Valley's largest search engine companies and had no idea that the guy she was sitting next to shared a back fence with him. And like practically as a godchild to his children. I was just sitting there like, breathe, 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 breathe. Talk to her after. So that's just my 2 cents on this whole picture.
That's valuable, Lisa. Thanks so much. Joe's going to talk to us a little bit about building your board.
Well, thanks for having me. My name is Joe Dobrensky, and I'm with Sequoia Capital. I'll spend just a minute on my role because it's a bit unique here in the Valley. I'm a human capital partner at Sequoia, which means that I worry about all things people related, mostly across our portfolio, but also within our firm. And that involves with our portfolio organizational development, designing org charts, recruiting, compensation, HR issues, as well as helping to introduce our portfolio companies to our vast network of contacts. But one thing I spend a lot of time doing is recruiting board members. I've probably recruited, 30 or 40 over the past couple of years. And I've been on my soapbox within my firm for years on the importance of having very strong outside directors with our companies. They add incredible perspective. And let's be frank, our guys are incredibly busy, some on close to double-digit boards. It's hard for them to really focus on all of their companies. So I think it's incredibly important, and we as a firm are big advocates of using outside directors. Another thing I like to say is a board can, and Mike touched on this, as did Lisa, that a board can be a tremendous asset to a company, and I think a pretty cheap one too. They don't cost a lot, and you can get a lot of value, but you got to use it properly, and I think other members of the panel here would speak to that more, but they're often not used as well as they could be. When I look at staffing a board or recruiting for a board, it really depends on the stage of the company, as Mike talked about. For an early stage company, it might just be one person, but you're looking for a specific skill set. It may be, if it's a technology company, maybe that board member should be a Mark Andreessen type, somebody who's going to be a magnet for engineers, or maybe it's just a general purpose businessman because the founder is a 22-year-old CS grad who's never had a job in his or her life. For later stage companies, it's more about filling specific roles, as Mike talked about, and it's finding an audit committee chair, and it's finding somebody who can be a CEO coach, or maybe it's somebody who can help with M&A if that is a need for the company. Also, as Mike suggested, that you build your board like you build your management team. You have to look at it in aggregate. You look at a matrix of skills, of domain experience, and of styles. Very, very important. One board where I recently recruited a member. We needed somebody that could cut to the chase because everybody else was a bit long-winded. So we found somebody that could get to decisions, which will make a 5-hour board meeting, hopefully a 2-hour board meeting. Another phrase I've heard, which I believe in, a board of successful people did not necessarily equal a successful board. I think that's an important point to think about. And then just a few generic pieces of advice about recruiting board members. Clearly define the role and clearly define the time requirements. It's a lot of time. A lot of people just think it's fun to be on boards, get to hobnob with the VCs. You want somebody who's committed to helping you and spending the time. I'm a little bit wary of big names. Doesn't mean a big name can't help a board, but sometimes the bigger the name, the less time they have to actually help, or maybe aren't that close to the scene of the crime here where they can help being very active. So one of our companies, which we'll remain nameless, was convinced that they wanted to recruit Oprah Winfrey to their board. And I remember explaining to them, I don't think we're going to get Oprah, and I'm not so sure she's going to help us in our
Should we try to guess which company that was?
Kleiner Perkins just got Tony Blair.
Yeah, Khosla did, yeah.
Khosla, that's right.
Another thing is local board members. I think it's important, particularly for an early stage company, to find somebody who's local, who can spend the time. If it's monthly, if it's every 6 weeks, when somebody's on the phone, they're just not as engaged, in my opinion. I think being local is important. Another one is not to just look at CEOs. People tend to say, hey, I need CEO experience on my board, but you can get terrific people who are chief marketing officers or head of operations who can add more value for whatever your particular need is. Another one is speak to multiple candidates. Sometimes people just pick the first board member and just, okay, I don't want to offend this person, I'm going to hire him. Talk with other people. Beyond that, reference that person, and reference that person as a board member, not as an executive. Make sure you know the people. The folks that you recruit for boards are big boys. If they don't get the job, it's not the end of the world. But a lot of our young entrepreneurs are scared to not offer a job to someone. You have that right. And then lastly, sometimes your best advisor is not actually on your board. And a lot of our CEOs who I talk with regularly have a consigliere type who can work with them, often with less restrictions. I think that's a particularly useful relationship for a number of our CEOs.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Joe. Mark is our cleanup hitter and is going to cover a number of topics, including problem board members, boards of advisors, board dynamics. So Mark Leslie, thanks.
Okay. By way of background, I was the CEO of 3 companies serially. The last one was Veritas Software. I described them as a win, a lose, a draw. The last one was the win, so it was in the right order. I have been a CEO since 1980, and I actually recall my first board meeting that I went to was the one I was running, and I was really nervous about that. So that's okay too. And in my career, and I've over the years been on many boards, probably 40, 50 boards over that period of time, including my own. So I have seen it from both sides. As an entrepreneur, I love having a board. It's a place to go that people who have interest and understanding of your business, interest and understanding of you, and are there to help you. So it was really good to do. I like board meetings because it gives you an opportunity to kind of tidy up everything you're thinking about, put it in one place, and look at it. Okay, so I thought I'd talk about, first of all, what makes for a good board meeting, what makes for a bad board meeting. In the earliest stage, in the beginning of time when you're just starting out in your company, board meeting, you want to hear from the board member's point of view. You want to hear from the CEO from where the product is. You want to hear where sales or marketing is as a function of whether you're a sales-driven or marketing-driven company. And you want to hear about how much cash we have and when do we have to raise more. Product schedule remediation if necessary. If you're doing any high-level recruiting, you want to hear about that. Pre-beta customer contacts, competition, and I would say maximum time of 2 hours. If you have a meeting of a startup company that's more than 2 hours, you're wasting your time and their time. Bad news. It's urgent to get bad news out as rapidly as possible. As soon as you get bad news, you get it to your board members. Good news, you can hold on to. And there's nothing as good in a board meeting as walking in and saying, I have a great announcement to make. So hang on to your good news and bring it in as a surprise. Is that good advice?
Love that. The best is when they hear about it on Twitter or Facebook first, and they email you.
But good news, hold on to it and make a ceremony out of it. Once you've reached beta time, the board meeting changes because now you're engaged with customers and you're engaged with revenue and things of that nature. So you want to know, customer status, customer information, hear again from the CEO in terms of product sales and/or marketing and finance. You want customer feedback and impact on product requirements. As soon as you're in the market, customers are going to start telling you what it doesn't do, what it does wrong, what it does poorly, why they're not going to buy. You want to hear that at the board meeting. You want to continue to hear about competition. In the board meeting, once you're in the market, you want a sales forecast, and a sales forecast needs to have names, numbers, dates, and percentages. Mostly in young companies, they come in and they pull this crumpled napkin out and they put it on the table and they say, yeah, we're talking to 4 guys and we think they're going to buy something someday, but we don't know how much or when. So you want to get a lot more specific than that. And it's an exercise for yourself, because the list is going to grow over time, and you really want to be able to start using it as a forecasting mechanism inside the company. Cash consumption and runway to cash out. Maximum board time at that point in time is probably 3 hours. There's more to talk about. Bad board meetings tend to be 4 hours or 5 hours. They tend to have beauty contests from all the VPs. All the VPs come in and, they kind of, each one gets a certain amount of time, and, HR will come in and talk about it, and marketing will come in and talk about their PR campaigns, and most of the board members kind of looking at their iPhones and Blackberries at that point in time. And also bad board meetings have frequent journeys down to a rat hole of some kind, where they'll just get into something and, they'll glom onto it. One of the things I thought I would talk about today is, what do you do with a bad board member? A bad board member is someone who is not constructive and who's someone you probably don't get along with in your meeting. If that bad board member is an investor, you're probably stuck with that person. And what you need to do when you have these differences of opinion about how things are going is you actually need to go take them off-site, lunch, dinner, whatever, and you need to confront the issue. And you need to say, look, we're going to these board meetings, we don't agree on these things, we need to talk about it and talk these things through, and you need to kind of get closure on that stuff so that you turn it into as constructive a relationship as you possibly can. If you have an independent board member that's a bad board member, you're going to have to ask them to leave. And no one likes doing that. And I, by the way, have had both of these in my career. The way you do that is you sit down and you say, look, it's clear this is not working out. We, kind of have fireworks at the board meeting. You're a really smart guy. You've made a great contribution to the company, but it's just not working. So what we'd like to do is allow you to vest all your unvested options, because you want to be as generous and gracious as you can at this point in time. We want to continue to use you as an advisor to the company in the future, and we want to shake hands and be friends at this point in time. So you want to confront both of those issues. I thought I'd touch on one last topic, which is boards of advisors, which don't get a lot of coverage in these meetings. They're really good. Most people have boards of advisors that they use one-on-one. I have not found that to be as constructive as making an investment in a board of advisors, where you actually bring them in together, you present to them the same way that you would present to a board of directors. By doing so, you give them the information and the context that allows them to have a continuity, that allows them to be actually worthwhile to you, because they actually know what you're doing and what you're facing and what your issues are and what's going on in the management team and the different departments and things like that. So it increases the more they know about your company, the more it increases their value, rather than just kind of, pinging this one, pinging this one, pinging that one. I try to, one of the little tricks I learned is I try to keep them interested by coming to these meetings. Instead of vesting their stock annually or over 4 years, we vest it based on the amount of meetings they show up at. I had great attendance. So I used to give them whatever the option was. You get 1/16, like a 4-year window. You get 1/16 for every quarterly meeting you show up at. And they used to show up. And they were fine with it, they didn't take any offense at that.
And you had short board meetings.
We did. Actually, and the other thing about a board of advisors, and I used to do this, I used to always, kind of open the meeting by saying, I love meeting with you guys because I'm going to tell you everything we're doing. We're going to talk about all our problems. We're going to have these very open discussions. And when we leave here, I don't have to listen to anything you told me. I can do what I feel like doing. With a board of directors, when you open things up and someone has an opinion about something, you either have to do it or you have to go back and explain why you're not doing it. So board of advisors gives you a freedom that you don't have in a regular board. And one last comment, if we have just one last thing I'd like to leave, a thought that I'd like to leave with you. When you have a board of directors, it's your job to lead the company and lead the discussion and lead the and be the leader of what's going on as a CEO of a company. To the extent that you sometimes don't listen to your board because you're doing what you believe is the right thing for the company, you may get fired, you may not get fired. But I can tell you with absolute certainty that if you go to your board meeting and you listen to your board all the time, 100% of the time, meaning they're now running the company, you will get fired. This is true?
I've never been a CEO before, but I think the best board members will acknowledge that they don't know how to run your
Yes.
company, but they want to
Hopefully.
know why you disagree.
Yeah. So those are my
Great
comments.
advice, Mark.
Very helpful. So I have a question or two that the audience might be interested in for our panel. Operating experience. I keep hearing, I'm putting together my board, I keep hearing about the value of operating experience. I don't have a lot myself, I have a little. I've got some investors on my board. So is operating experience infinitely transferable from high-tech to low-tech companies or service to product companies? If you have operating experience running a company, can you transfer it readily into another context or not? How does the panel feel about that?
I think it has to be qualified, that it's not across every industry, particularly if you're talking about the tech industry. I think it really helps to have the experience from the tech industry, from an analogous company.
I had a very interesting situation with my co-founder, who is our COO. She used to run product lines worth $100 to $200 million in sales for companies like Harmonic and Terion. And my experience is turning content into an assembly line. But the key thing that knitted our backgrounds together was that she's used to working with large developer communities. She was large developer communities of engineers, and the ability to work at a grassroots level to advocate turned out to be the key. That and the fact that she has a mind like a steel trap allowed her to use that operations experience. So I think it's finding the common thread for us that has worked.
I think that, I think of myself as a board member, I have the greatest value in the companies that are closest to my experience, in my background of experience. And the companies that I've been on the boards of that are kind of far afield from that, I'm doing as much learning as I am, I'm really learning. Businesses are extremely unique and complex, and you get into any business and there's just a lot of stuff there. And if you're not familiar with the business, you got to learn it. So it sometimes can take a long time.
And the only thing I'd add too, and to follow up to that point, I have noticed, I think general purpose operating experience may be the most valuable, because sometimes people try and recruit somebody directly from that domain, and that can actually be counterproductive. I think of the world of software. A lot of these SaaS software as a service companies recruited CEOs from the perpetual license world, and they might not get this business model and might actually lead you in a wrong direction or two. So I think you need to be wary of that. I've seen that a number of times across our portfolio.
Well, I'd say one dimension to watch out for is if someone who you're recruiting comes from a big company but has had no exposure to startups or smaller high-growth companies, then oftentimes that person's a bit of a fish out of water. If they come from a big company and they have the startup experience, then you've got a good combination.
So I've got my board mostly together, And as I think about my own skills and the skills of my partner and the skills of the board members I have so far, nobody's really long on the finance side. You know, that's never been one of my strengths. So I'm thinking about bringing on my board an investment banker. What does the panel think of that?
Not a positive reaction.
So,
Are we being taped?
I'm gonna say, is that like a joke?
You're being taped.
Well, I like investment
If
bankers.
everybody thinks no, I'm gonna make a strong case for yes. So I'd like to hear your points of view.
I would answer first, of someone with a finance background as a CFO would be valuable. But investment bankers, they don't really do finance, they do fundraising.
Can I offer up a thought? What's interesting is that the managing partner of Azure, Mike Quatnetz, was a leading researcher for huge investment banks. And that has dramatically affected his approach to the space. His due diligence process, I think he probably knows my DNA. And I actually got to know him better and like him even more through this process. And his connections through his years of investment banking have worked beautifully for us. But he is not an investment banker now. He's our backer. So that is the distinction I would make. And that would be, I would think if he were still that person, it would not be in my comfort zone.
Okay.
So I was actually thinking back, and I actually, after laughing about that, actually did recruit an investment banker to my board at one time. And it's a person who demonstrated real value in terms of our industry. He was an absolutely world-class strategic thinker. He has some financial skills, but that really wasn't the interesting part for me. And he ended up being a great board member. So I would say yes. In general, though, I'd say if someone asked me the question, anytime you want an investment banker, just call him up and he'll show up and he'll do anything you want for you. You're for hire. You know.
Anything to add, Joe? Or no?
We're being a little bit glib, but we have an invaluable set of investment banking professionals that we work with, particularly now that a number of our companies want to go public. And so that is important. Whether you need that skill set on your board, I think is very situational, but very important overall professional for us to have in our stable.
Yeah, I was already public when we recruited that guy, so we weren't, so it wasn't a conflict of interest kind of thing.
I've seen several situations of private companies that have done well, and it's time to borrow some money. And nobody has much of an entree to the risk capital marketplace or much of a feel for it. I know 2 such companies brought on investment bankers who said, I'll come and I'll sit with your interests at heart, and when it comes time for you to use an investment banker, I'll step aside. I won't compete for the business. These are regional or boutique investment bankers. And they've saved these companies a lot of money because they know where to look. They know what's going on. For example, today's debt market is bifurcated. It's really tough to borrow $15 or $20 million, but it's covenant light world again to borrow $600 million. So if you don't know that and you're trying to borrow $20 million or $600 million, when you get investment bankers coming in and talking to you, there's not a perfect match of agendas. There's not goal congruence. They're trying to sell you something. And if you have an interpreter on your side of the table to interpret what they're saying, it can sometimes be very helpful. My last question before we open it up is, how are big decisions actually made at boards? I know that I was in my class last week, I had an MBA student say, well, it's really important to have that 3-2 balance in your favor, because when they call for the vote, you want to be sure 3 hands are raised. So that's not really the perception of the way board decisions are made. So I'll ask our panel to give us all advice as to how they would proceed with their board if they had a big decision that they wanted to get the board to make, such as a change in strategic direction, a major financing, an acquisition. How would you proceed with your board?
Well, that's where the one-on-one conversations that we talked about really come in handy. If you can help steer, if not determine the debate before the meeting, then you're far better off. So if you can try to win people over one-on-one, you have a much better chance of winning. Because what happens if you just open it up to the meeting, then it could easily spiral out of your control, because all of a sudden your other board members are going to try to take control of that issue, and then you might not get your way. One caveat is that in these tougher times where companies have a hard time raising money, oftentimes the investor that's sitting there willing to write a $10 or $20 million check to keep the company alive usually gets their way when it comes to a decision like that.
Any other thoughts?
I think that I have never been on a board where a big decision was made without a unanimous vote. And if you have a board that isn't constructed in such a way that that can happen, you have to go fix that board because it's a broken board. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody doesn't do their homework. That doesn't mean I think one-on-one meetings, I always used to do that when I had a big thing to get done. I used to go out and, meet with each individual. Not so much to necessarily influence them to do what I wanted to do, although that certainly was an element, but it was also to learn and to kind of talk through in more leisurely, more kind of, less guarded way, less formal way, talk through what the issues were. But big issues, I think everybody gets engaged. They're talked through in a good board very, very thoughtfully, very carefully, and then a decision is made that usually has the support of everybody in the room in a genuine way. And I'd say if you can't do that with your board, you've got a problem with your board.
Be glad to have your questions now for the panel.
What's your, tell us a little bit about, maybe talk regarding compensation for both the board of directors and the advisory board?
You want me to take a stab at that? I spent a lot of time on it. Specifically, just how much to offer, what the package looks like, just everything. It depends on the stage of the company. And it also somewhat depends on the role. I know some people think that all board members should receive the same grant. I personally don't agree with that because certain roles are just much more time intensive. You might be the chairman or the lead board member or the audit committee chair, which nowadays is a tremendous amount of work. So we typically offer what we think is a pretty generous equity grant, which again depends on the stage of the company. In terms of the terms of it, it's typically a 4-year vest. Sometimes it's less, and it is 100% acceleration upon an acquisition on a single trigger. There's rarely cash compensation unless the company is spending a lot of cash at that point, and we don't have a lot of companies in our private portfolio that generate a lot of cash. So it's mostly only equity at this point.
And can you give us a sense of amount, percentage?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple exceptions. We have, on the low end, we have a later stage company now that arguably is worth hundreds of millions of dollars, at least we hope it is. And in that case, the equity grant may only be 0.1%, maybe a little bit more than that. But we think that, we did an analysis on it, and we think that's going to be a valuable grant. I think maybe more typical for a Series A, Series B company is a 1/4 point, maybe to a 1/2 point of the company. But occasionally it'll be more if you need somebody. Right now we have a company, quite frankly, that's a bit troubled. And we have a CEO, we're not sure if he's going to make it. And so we found who we think is a gem, a recently retired CEO, which is just a profile I really like to have on our board. Want to stay active, still fresh, and has the time. And in this case, it's well over a point we're giving this person for that situation.
Is it similar in advisory boards?
So advisory boards would be some fraction of a board member. So I would say an A round, I would say 0.5% I think would probably be more typical than 1/4%. And if you have someone who's, high prestige, high value, you probably pay more. An advisory board is probably 0.1% in a young company. I don't know, 1/10, would you say?
Probably. Again,
Yeah.
depends on how active that person
Yeah.
will be.
Well, it doesn't vest unless they show up for the meeting, so it doesn't matter.
And part of the appeal to attracting a advisor is not so much the stock. That's just part of it. It's more they're excited by the vision of your product they want to get together with their peers, because usually you get together a whole group of them for a half a day or a day, and they brainstorm about the future of this technology or market. So they really enjoy that process. You're trying to make it a fun process to engage them with the extra bonus of the equity kicker.
Yeah, you have to be a little bit careful about the equity for board of advisors. They're typically working for companies in a field, in their expertise in the same. And it is a conflict of interest if there's any possible interaction between the two companies. It also may be a conflict of interest for an employee to have essentially a second income of some kind or another. And I think it's a good practice to talk to each individual to say, is this a conflict of interest, and do you need to disclose this to your company, et cetera?
One other point I forgot is they're typically not a one-year cliff for a board member.
Or for advisors either.
Or for advisors. And for advisors, it could be a compressed vesting schedule, maybe over 2 years.
Can you explain that term so we're all on the same page?
Which term, sorry?
Cliff?
Oh, cliff vesting, that just means typical executive option grant or any employee grant here in the Valley, your stock does not vest until you're at the company for a year. So if you leave at day 360, theoretically you'd walk away with no stock. In the case of a board member, you don't have that, so you would vest most likely monthly.
Well, I have a question for Joe. Since you guys are so good at attracting industry people to your boards, what tips do you have to attract those people? How do you sell the industry veteran to join your board?
I think it's no different than any other company. You got to sell the company. You got to sell. Most people have lots of demands on their time, so you have to make it worth their while in terms of they're going to enjoy the process. They have the opportunity to make money. Let's be honest about it, and they really want to do it. I think those are the three things that we look for. I don't think it's any different, though. You know, sometimes we can sell Sequoia a little bit. You get more exposure to us. I think that gets us maybe a little bit somewhere, but it's really on the company.
Some
in my
people also, the affiliations, they look at other board members and they say, I'd like to be on a board with her or with him. High prestige, might learn something, successful, well-connected. There's that element as well.
One other little thing, though, sorry, and then I'll let Mark speak. When I talk to somebody as a prospective candidate for a board, and all of the questions are about who's the board member at my firm, and don't ask questions about the company, they become less interesting to me as a prospect, because I think they're not doing it for the right reasons.
Most of the time, when I get recruited on a board, based on my experience, I think I'm probably going to end up not making any money, because you don't know how these things go, and so I tend to want to like the business, like the market, like the person, like the board. If I make some money, that's nice. That's what it is for me.
I would like to hear maybe one or two war stories about having to remove or change the CEO with an eye towards, advice for how a CEO can avoid that fate.
Well, don't run out of money, would be one. Make your plan, that would be another. Probably comes down to those two things.
No felonies.
I think boards will stay with a CEO for a long time, probably oftentimes too long. I could tell you this: if management comes in to the board members and says, "This guy's not working, this woman's not working, whatever," that person's gone. So, and that happens more often than you think. That boards will get to know management, and when things are not going well in the company, oftentimes it's the next level of executives that will go to the board and say it's not working and we got a problem over here, and you have to take action when it happens. When things are going well, when you're making your plan, you're making revenue, nobody wants to fire the CEO, even if they think there's issues. If it's kind of going okay, nobody wants to fire the CEO because it's going okay. On the other hand, the flip side of that is if you're getting recruited to be a CEO of some young company, it's usually because it's broken. It's true.
More true than not true. More true than not true. Not always, but more true than not true. 80% of the time.
So Mark's mentioned a couple of times now the interaction of management or other employees with the board, either through the beauty pageant of walking in through it, or in that case, reaching out to the board if it wasn't. Could you or someone else on the panel just talk a little bit more about, I just left a company that I was in a senior role in, was occasionally wheeled in and felt that I was basically just boring everybody. But there must be times when input is valuable from senior management, or would you prefer the CEO to be just there working with the board himself and all these?
So I've been on bigger boards with public companies, and one of the things I've found effective in public companies is to have dinners that include the senior management team. And that way you sit down next to people and you're gonna have little private conversations. I got to know a lot of basically all of the next tier people in the company. Another thing I'll do is if I'm on a public company board now and there's a significant issue in the company, and I've gone to the CEO and said, look, I'd like to go, it's an area, it's a software issue, it's an area that I understand. I'd like to go spend some time there. You've told the board this is an area of risk. I'm probably the best board member to actually understand this thing, so I want to go one-on-one with this executive and spend a half a day with that person. So that's another way to get to know people. I think good board members will make it their business to get to know the next people in the company and to give those people a feeling that they can come to them if they want to.
I'd like to offer up just a quick thought. This is my fourth startup, the first one where I've been a CEO. And I think that what's really working for us is the fact that since all of us are veterans now in the consumer space of 1.0 and before that, I really tried to hire people who are brands themselves. The woman running our revenue group in our New York office, world famous in sales to women's oriented companies. Our head of technology ran a major division in IBM for years. The guy who's running our brand used to rebrand Walmart. He's worked everywhere. I think particularly for a first-time CEO, the concept of an imperial CEO that works by herself with the board is something that A, I don't think serves the best interests of the company, and B, is not something where I think that the board members are going to appreciate as much about the company as I'd like for them to. So I think that my job is to corral all these great big egos and experiences into one really well-modulated 45-minute management update where they talk about, here were our numbers, here's what we hit, here's what we didn't, here's why. We are going to be profitable in Q3 and beyond. And what's been interesting to me has been an opportunity to be able to give these executives an opportunity to get to know this board, and yet at the same time to be able to demonstrate to the board that they may all be older than I am, but at the same time, I'm doing an excellent job of working with them to help them lead their divisions where I know the female user wants to go. I would think it would take a remarkable lack of confidence on the part of the CEO if you didn't introduce the board members to your team in some of the ways that Mark described. I wouldn't think I would want to be a senior executive at a company like that.
If you're a board member and the CEO doesn't want you to see management, huge red flag.
I'm with you.
That's a company that's going to be trouble.
That's right. At the same time, there's a whole mojo of getting your team into shape to get ready to go out and do a very good job at these board meetings, because not everybody can do that. And with that, I just want to really thank you all for asking my opinions, and thank you, Irv, so much for having me on the panel.
Thank you for
What a
being
great
here.
panel.
Okay.
Thank you. It's
Thank
so
you.
nice to see you.
Good luck in your.
Thank you.
Well, to continue with Lisa's point, I think it comes across very well when the CEO is strong enough to bring out their VPs, to present the good results, to put a positive face on what they're doing. And then it looks like you're building a strong team and you're confident in your relationship with that person. On the other side, I've seen CEOs say, well, I'm going to bring this VP out to deliver the bad news and kind of let the board members rip that guy and not take any of the blame and sort of deflect to this other guy. So that would be something to avoid doing.
I would like to offer a thought on a topic that has not been mentioned, and that is executive sessions. And to my eye, best practice is moving toward the following. And that is, a typical executive session is when management is excused after the board meeting and the CEO meets with the directors. And if there are management directors, they're generally not in the room, other management directors. But then, best practice is now moving to a second level of executive session where the CEO is excused and the outside board members meet alone. And to me, the key there is immediate feedback from that session to the CEO. So, on the part of a spokesperson or a group of people if they wish to be present from the outside board. So that the CEO doesn't feel overnight, gee, they had an executive session, I wasn't in it, I wonder what they said, and the fact that they haven't called me might be ominous. But an awful lot of constructive feedback can be crafted real time, right at the time of the meeting. You know, you let so-and-so go on too long, this conversation, to pick up Mark's phrase, went into a rat hole, we spent 20 minutes there that were wasted. So 2 levels of executive session after the board meeting is good practice in my opinion. One with the CEO present and one with just the outside directors, non-management directors, after which it's important for a spokesperson from that group to meet with the CEO.
Just also refreshing for the board members to have a little time to reflect on what they heard without anybody. It's really good. It's actually a good thing to do.
Right.
Well, I want to underscore the last part of what you said, to also communicate what the board said to the CEO. Because I completely understand if you're a CEO, you're going to build up paranoia. There's just no question about it. So having that open communication will go a long way towards reducing that.
Can I ask a question on that? Why would you need the CEO to step out if he was trusted?
Because no matter how trusted she or he is, the conversation is just freer. It's just freer. And it's a way, I don't think the trust is impaired at all. If you faithfully report back to the CEO immediately thereafter.
It should be noted that public companies, Sarbanes-Oxley, New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, require a certification of independence of a collection of directors, particularly in the audit committee, things like that, and they require executive sessions without the CEO present in the room. They require that.
I think there's another...
And it is actually a very good practice. It's a best practice. There's no question about it.
Another element where if you're a board member, you're trying to be positive and constructive, and you might want to change the plan or suggest improvements, but you don't want to be too negative, because if you're too negative, you lose your effectiveness. Whereas without the CEO there, sometimes you feel freer to voice your negative concerns, knowing that it's in an environment that it's not really going to cause a problem.
Yes.
I have a question on when it makes sense to form a board or a board of advisors. It seems like boards are usually created when you get your first outside round of financing. Does it ever happen at other times? And if not, when would you think it makes sense to do a board of advisors?
I think if there's a need, I think it comes down to that. I've talked to a number of my friends who are CEOs, and often early on they had the 7-member advisory panel. They get together. They don't really get any value out of it. It's what I've heard is if there's a specific task you want to address, then I think it's useful. Otherwise, I think it can be more of a distraction personally, particularly early on. There may be other opinions.
I'll give you two personal examples. I ran a military computer company at one time, and we needed to figure out how to go sell to all the stuff that we couldn't see. So we built an advisory board that had a collection of retired 3-star, 4-star generals. And they knew where all the bodies were buried, and they knew who, and they connected us, and they went out of the meetings convinced that this was a great thing because we were telling them what we're doing and how it worked and everything like that. We got invaluable help from those people, insight into what's important and access to the community that they were part of. In another company, my most recent company, in the early years, the industry was in a lot of change, and we were trying to navigate. It was the early years of, it was the early 90s. We're trying to figure out which operating systems were going to be dominant in the future. It was a very complicated problem. And we got people from a collection of different places who were in the business And we met with them every quarter, and we took their pulse, and we actually probably talked about the same thing over and over again. But it was that complex and that rich to talk about. It was extremely valuable to the company. So those are two examples.
Can you talk about just thematically having an open, honest discussion at a board meeting as opposed to having it effectively be scripted theater? So you've all mentioned pre-meetings, which oftentimes devolves into pre-wiring, which evolves into or devolves into a 2-hour meeting where everyone knows what's coming. It's sort of very rote, progress through the 10 to 20 slides that are there and a few cursory comments and you go home. I mean, personally in board meetings I've been in of that format, I just feel like, why did we even spend the 2 hours? The 2 hours was a waste. We all knew in advance what was coming. It was clearly not a forum for open discussion. Either both the investors sort of, in an unstated way, consented to that, and also the CEO seemed to want things that way. So I just, what are your opinions on that? Having more of an open, honest discussion versus, other alternatives.
Great question. I mean, the way I think about it as well, most meetings, you're not really making a major decision. It is more of an update. So it's okay to, even though you kind of describe it in negative terms, I'd say, well, it's not that bad. It's when you have that major inflection point that you need to be open and to be able to face the issues. And so the company has to be able to change gears to handle that. But it's a good question whether companies are nimble enough to change their approach to deal with that or not.
So there's a certain, over the years, I hope you kind of pick up a certain humility. I think you make better decisions when you have multiple people who are thoughtful, smart, and informed talking about the same topic. When I'm on a board and a CEO, and there's a big decision, and the CEO wants to one-on-one everybody and then have a decision, I generally say, look, we need to talk about this as a group because I need to hear what everybody else has to say, and we need to actually look at the corner cases and, get people who consider things from different points of view, because that's valuable in terms of the outcome of the decision. And I will request that if it's something important. But like you say, if it's just an update meeting, I mean.
Well, I also think that there's always a time for spontaneity in response to operating results that are reported to you. So particularly negative or disappointing results. And so, well, we missed in this particular sector, and so, but we're intending to make next quarter. Well, it seems to me, what are you doing differently to make next quarter? How do you feel about the person leading that charge? And that's where different perspectives can be heard. I was actually on a board call this morning where there's a significant sector of this company that's underperforming and has been for some time, and nobody had scripted what board members were saying at all, and they all chimed in with different thoughts about evaluating the management there and different approaches that might be taken, some benchmarking against competition. So there was a lot of spontaneity in the meeting. I think the scripting comes from being sure you're giving board members adequate warning about something that you want to bring up and reach a decision on at a forthcoming meeting. And sometimes that's an easy decision to make one-on-one, and sometimes, such as Mark mentions, it's better to have the group discuss it.
So I had, in my board at my last company, I trusted, and I respected my board members. I was extremely comfortable talking about complex, difficult things at a meeting in a way. I would brief them in advance because it just saves a lot of time and you get a lot, you learn a lot. But I was extremely comfortable about taking real issues into the board to discuss it, and I wanted that. I mean, I wanted a board. It's awful lonely running a company, let me tell you.
Yes?
Are there factors that are not related to the performance of the company that would make you concerned about serving on the board for that company? Are there things that the entrepreneurs or CEOs might not understand that would affect your point of view, let's say going into gambling as a business or online pornography or something like that? Are there things that you think about as a board member that executives might not understand the reputational risk for?
Well, as a fund, we're a partnership, so we all have to agree to invest in the company. And so we usually filter out those issues right away. So it's almost never a surprise that the company would be going into something we didn't already know and like. So from the venture capital perspective, I don't really see it as an issue.
Do you maybe serve as an audit committee expert on your boards?
I'm sorry, have?
As the audit committee chair?
I have been a chairman of an audit committee, but I consider myself to be unqualified, so. It's a very, very high skill set. I was doing it because there was no one else to do it, and they asked me, I was the only independent director at the time. It's a very, very specialized skill set to do that. And the answer, I mean, as board members, I mean, I would never serve on a board of a company that I didn't respect the business they were in and want to be part of that. So if they were doing one of those two things, I just wouldn't be interested.
I also think that there's a lot of complexity that people in the company may understand that directors may not understand, but I believe it's the job of the CEO to translate the essentials of that business to the board such that they really understand what the value drivers and the key risks are. It's very much like going to a physician who knows a tremendous amount about a topic of your health or a loved one's health and can use all kinds of words that you and I have never heard before and can make it opaque. But if you ask them to explain what's really going on in plain terms and what the alternatives are from which we're choosing and start to ask logical questions, you start to get some light shed on a very complex topic. And I think that's analogous to translating a complex business in a way that board members can understand it and be helpful.
I'd go further. I'd say a critical component, character component for a successful CEO is the ability to do that pervasively.
Right.
You get, a company gets bigger, you have to do it with your own employees. You have to take complicated things and explain them in a way that are simple, clear. You have to abstract complexity and make it simple and clear. But it's pervasive that you have to do that.
I agree.
Are there any issues recruiting VCs to your board of advisors who you don't necessarily want them to invest, but you want them to be kind of advising you? Are there, because most of the time they want to know about your company, either invest or not, but if you can persuade someone that you like and trust to be on the board of advisors instead of investing, is there any issues with that?
It's very uncommon. I'd say the board of advisors are more for people who know your technology or know your market or are possible customers or partners. Most VCs, probably 99.9, would say no to that offer. Now they might take a different advisor role and say, well, I'm not going to be on the board of advisors, but I could be your trusted advisor to get to know you, and maybe I'll be there to invest at a later date.
Why wouldn't you, why if they want to invest, and they could afford it and it wasn't problematic, why wouldn't you say, okay?
I mean, there are specific people, like you know the person's background and they actually have operational experience or other experience. They happen to be a partner at a firm. You don't necessarily want them to be investing in your company, but you want them.
Generally speaking, their firm won't permit them.
Yeah, we won't. It's too difficult. A, everybody is so busy. Number two, maybe this company is potentially competitive with one of ours. Maybe in a vastly different field or a not-for-profit, I can see it.
It's not going
probably
to
beyond
happen.
that.
Mostly it's not going to happen. Yeah. Don't worry about it. It's not going to happen.
Is there any value in a technical advisory board, a technical board?
The one I talked about, the second one, was highly technical. It was very, very, very high-quality technical people. So it depends on your company, what problem you want to try to solve.
Well, just an example. So if you're selling to enterprises, people love to get CIOs on their board of advisors to help address the direction the technology is going that the customer cares about.
What can CEOs do to mitigate the perceived liability risk of being a public company director?
Well, I can tell you one thing. I read the indemnification agreements carefully. I make sure if a company's going public that there's a D&O insurance. And if I sense, and I've done this, if I sense that there is, CEO is, for instance, reckless or something like that, I mean, that's a character person, I get off the board.
Well, having a strong CFO helps because most of the issues one would likely face, I think, come around to the accounting. And so if you have a CFO who's got experience you trust, that helps you get comfortable.
How about for a private company? So a lot of software companies, you can start without a lot of funding. Are you reluctant to be, are people reluctant to be in the board of directors of a company like that because they could be sued, especially if it's a consumer type website?
Which type of company?
Like, let's say you're starting a company that's a website that addresses consumers directly. Are people reluctant to be on the board of directors of that company, even if it's private?
I can view it as a special risk.
I'm not
area.
sure. I think some of us are missing the risk there, that you're
Well,
seeing.
consumers could sue the company.
Yeah.
And the company, since it has no funding, can't really pay for a lot of insurance.
Generally speaking, I mean, I'm not an attorney, but generally speaking, there's pretty clear division or protection for board members. If a board members, meet their duty of loyalty and duty of care, and things go wrong in the company, the board members are probably protected. That doesn't mean you don't get sued, but they're probably protected.
Yeah.
Agree.
So, and a corporation itself is an entity that kind of insulates the board members, right? So, I don't think there's, you should talk to an attorney, but I don't think there's a real issue there.
No, more just making people feel comfortable. Since
If they have,
you're a public company, you can carry a lot of insurance that protects the director. But if you're private, you have $10,000 in the bank.
yeah, but you're not gonna get any shareholder suits either. I mean,
There's
if
nothing
you have a
to sue.
sophisticated person in mind, they'll have an opinion about that, so.
We have time for one more question, Mark.
So if we have an early stage company, I was thinking of putting 3 skilled but well-known people, friends to me, as a sort of interim board to get me used to going through some of these processes and help us kind of pilot them out. And I would assume that those people would transition out as we raise outside funds and things like that. Do you guys recommend anything for an early stage company, which I assume most of us are, to help get us to where these processes are in place and these people are well known to one another? Because there is kind of a ramp up to get a functioning board together to do all the very desirable things you guys are describing.
I'd be careful about putting them on, because it's easier to get them on than it is to get them off.
We set this up
Yeah,
as
you're-
advisory positions, so
Yeah.
we sort of.
Yeah, if they were formal board members, I would agree with Mark. You don't want to do it because you're setting yourself up for an awkward situation. And most people probably wouldn't even agree to be a transitional board member if you're talking about an official board member. But it sounds like you then qualify to say, well, actually, it's a board of advisors, in which case you can be a lot looser.
Okay. And what would you guys see as anything standard? Do people put any kind of board in place until they have to?
I think it's very personal. If you feel it'll be helpful to you, you should do it. I like having a board. I mean, if I didn't need one, I'd get one, so.
Yeah, right.
I think a board's a great resource, and so if you construct it well, it can really be helpful to you. It's certainly not something to be feared. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, panel.